Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're really digging into author Lionel Shriver's perspective, and it's a pretty controversial one, on what she sees as the deep psychological currents shaping progressive views on immigration. This is all based on a recent interview she gave.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at how Shriver frames the whole debate. Then, we'll get into her psychological diagnosis. After that, we'll explore the cultural fallout she talks about. And finally, we'll look at what she thinks is the real root cause of everything.
So let's start with this question. How did immigration get to be, as Shriver puts it, a perfectly divisive issue? You know, one of those topics where it feels like there's just no middle ground anymore.
Shriver kicks things off by pointing to the big controversy that this very comment stirred up. For her, it's the perfect starting point to really dig into the fierce moral and, well, linguistic battle lines that have been drawn around immigration.
And this gets into what Shriver calls a language war. Her point is that a word like colonized has become, well, its acceptability completely depends on who's saying it. She argues that from a progressive viewpoint, you might hear the idea of colonization in reverse celebrated, but if someone on the other side uses that exact same word to describe what's happening, it's immediately condemned.
So this is the key takeaway for Shriver. She's saying this isn't just a policy debate anymore, about economics or logistics. It's transformed into a moral absolute. It's like you're either all in for mass immigration and you're a good person, or you have any reservations and you're automatically cast as a bad one. There's just no room for nuance.
All right, so now let's get to the real heart of Shriver's argument. What's the psychological framework that she believes is holding up the progressive stance on all this?
Okay, so her diagnosis begins with this idea she calls performative guilt. Now, what does she mean by that? Well, she argues it's not actually feeling guilty for historical wrongs like slavery. Instead, it's a performance. It's a public display meant to signal your own virtue and, at the same time, your contempt for your fellow countrymen who aren't playing along with the same ritual.
In this quote right here, it really hits the nail on the head. Shriver draws this really sharp line between what she calls real guilt, which she says is a quiet, private thing, and these loud, public performances you might see at protests. In her mind, genuine shame is quiet. This other thing, it's righteous, and it's even hostile.
So building on that idea, Shriver starts to sketch out this psychological profile. She claims that with this mindset, the protesters become the main characters, the heroes of their own story. The activism, she argues, stops being about the immigrants, who, in her view, kind of become props or an excuse. It's really about the protesters getting a thrill from clashing with authority and, ironically, acting out what she calls a white savior narrative, the very thing they say they're against.
Okay, so from there, Shriver connects this individual psychology to what she sees as much bigger cultural trends. So let's take a look at the consequences she's talking about.
On a political level, she argues that this pro-mass migration stance is, at its core, a rejection of the nation-state. Her logic is pretty simple. If a country can't control its own borders, is it really a country anymore? In her view, it just becomes a piece of geography, nothing more than a way station.
And this, of course, leads us right into one of the most explosive parts of this whole conversation. Shriver doesn't shy away from the great replacement idea. She tackles it head-on, basically asking, is this just some fringe conspiracy theory, or is it, just a description of demographic reality?
And this is where Shriver points to what she sees as a major hypocrisy. She claims that on one hand, any concern about demographic change is immediately shot down as a racist conspiracy theory. But then, on the other hand, she says, you see the outcome of that very change, white populations becoming minorities, openly celebrated as a wonderful victory for diversity. She's pointing out what she sees as two completely contradictory positions.
And she connects this demographic shift directly to declining birth rates in the West. So from her point of view, it's not some grand secret plot. It's just a natural consequence. It's what happens when a civilization, as she puts it, is no longer willing or maybe even able to reproduce itself.
So where does all this come from? What's the root cause? Well, Shriver traces all these different threads, the performative guilt, the rejection of nationhood, the demographic changes. She traces it all back to one single fundamental thing she sees in modern Western culture.
And here's how she breaks down her final argument. It starts, she says, with a kind of pathological obsession with the self. This whole idea that your identity is something you discover, not something you build through effort and character. And the result of that, according to her, it leaves people feeling empty, anxious, and just miserable.
So if people are feeling this inner void, what do?
Well, in Shriver's theory, this is where activism comes in. It becomes a substitute for all the things that are missing. It gives you a purpose, a tribe to belong to, and that powerful feeling of being morally right, all of which can fill that emptiness left behind when traditional sources of meaning, like family or community, fade away.
Yeah, this quote really sums up her whole diagnosis. It's this strange paradox she's pointing to. A culture that is totally obsessed with the self, driven by vanity, but at the same time, it's producing people who are, in her words, actively miserable and desperately searching for something to believe in.
And that's what brings Shriver's whole argument full circle. An open borders policy, in her view, isn't just a random idea. It's the logical conclusion of a philosophy that rejects all boundaries. The implied question is a powerful one. If you get rid of all the boundaries on the self, personal rules, social norms, then why on earth would you keep national ones?
So, as we wrap up this breakdown of Lionel Shriver's argument, we're left with the really big question that she puts on the table. If those traditional things that gave people meaning, family, a strong community, a national identity, if they continue to fade away, what's going to replace them? What, if anything, is going to fill that void?